Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to EduSet Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in Political Science, we will be talking about Indo-US relationship from estrangement to engagement. To discuss this topic, we have with us our subject expert, Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science in Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. He has over 25 years of teaching experience. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome, Sir.
Thank you, Amrit. Good afternoon. Today's lecture we are going to devote on India-US relationship. This relationship is important not only from the point of view of these two countries, but also from the point of view of global politics as a whole. But interestingly, this India-US engagement has been shrouded in a lot of controversies, and over the years it has seen many ups and downs to the extent that at one point of time, India and United States of America didn't see eye to eye on any issue, global or regional. But things have over the years changed, and the change has been in direction of a more vibrant and creative engagement between these two democracies. In fact, in 90s, after Pokhran II, when India exploded its nuclear bomb and established itself as a nuclear power, it attracted sanction from most of the countries, developed countries of the world, and that was led by United States of America. But immediately after that sanction, we find that not only it was lifted after a few years, around 2000, but a new chapter was opened up in this Indo-US relationship. In fact, forcing Jaswant Singh, who was India's foreign minister in NDA-1 government, led by Atal Bihari Vajpayee, Jaswant Singh, rather, lamented the fact that how these two democracies didn't see eye to eye and were estranged, fellow travelers in global politics. In fact, he put it in these words that 5 wasted decades in this relationship. 5 wasted decades means after independence, India and United States of America basically were on two sides of the international divide. In spite of the fact that India didn't join any Cold War military alliances, and instead it decided to be part of a movement of the third world countries and the developed country, that is non-aligned movement. But even then, in fact, United States of America looked at India with a lot of skepticism and a lot of suspicion. Because it never believed in the viability and the justification of this movement called non-aligned movement. Because in United States of America's perception, the entire world was gripped with a kind of war, which was ideological war between democracy and the forces which are opposed to democracy, and therefore there was no third way in which this war could be fought. And United States of America believed that either a country was part of this democratic fight or was basically opposed to it, and therefore didn't believe and trust Nehru's non-aligned politics and non-aligned policy. But fact was different. In fact, India, when decided to look at this Cold War, it looked at it from the point of view of a third world country. In fact, it attached a lot of importance to its post-colonial sovereignty, which it had attained after a long struggle against colonial rule. At the same time, it also looked at the Cold War politics as the politics of military alliances, which meant arms race and so on and so forth. And the priorities which country like India had set forth themselves were basically the economic development. So therefore, joining Cold War politics at that time meant diversion of resources from development to armaments and arms race, and therefore India under Nehru rightly believed that this Cold War politics was not a fight between democracy and the forces which are opposed to democracy, but rather it was a kind of in the old colonial and imperialist policies had basically come in new garb that was in form of this Cold War. So that's why India didn't join the Cold War politics, but this was not appreciated by United States of America. Interestingly, when Jaswant Singh says 5 wasted decades, that was the decade when we find those decades when we find that both were estranged powers in the world politics, in spite of many common values which they cherished. In fact, two of them, United States and India, were the largest and the oldest democracies in the world. In fact, United States of America being the oldest and India being the largest. Both countries were pluralistic societies in the sense that many identities coexisted within a democratic setup. Both believed in constitutional democracy, both had the liberal politics, and both country cherished and basically were founded on the principle of civic nationalism. So therefore, what we find that this, in spite of these common values, we find that United States of America and India didn't find themselves to be on the same side of international divide. Now, how this relationship, materialized, how this relationship became so sour, how this relationship took such a turn in the history of international politics is a matter of study and research. But then there is a very definitive reason why these two countries didn't see eye to eye on many of the issues which basically confronted world politics. In fact, this entire relationship is to be seen in context of is to be seen in context of the larger Cold War politics. Now, this Cold War politics, as we know, was between the two superpowers, one led by Soviet Union, another camp was led by United States of America. But this Cold War basically coincided with India's freedom, which it attained after a long struggle against colonial rule. Now, India's freedom struggle and United States, which itself was not a direct colonial power at that time, in fact, rather it sympathized with India's freedom movement. In fact, one can say that Roosevelt, had a lot of empathy and sympathy for India's struggle for independence. But then, of course, it is also true that Roosevelt didn't come hard on Britain, because at that time it was not possible for him to antagonize the British power, though it was a decaying power, but nonetheless an important ally, an important force in world politics. Therefore, in fact, this entire approach, American approach towards India's freedom movement, was basically like a discuss. One can say that it was not actively, participating or basically putting pressure on the British imperial power to basically hasten this process of India's independence. But that is one dimension. But after independence, as I mentioned, that the Cold War politics became the immediate irritant between India and United States of America. It is a different matter that Nehru was basically who emerged as the leader of non-aligned movement and India's first prime minister. He was not trusted by both camps. It is not that Soviet Union also, took kindly his entire approach to international politics, because Soviet Union believed that this was a fight between imperialism and those who were opposed to imperialism, and therefore non-aligned movement had no justification in this fight. Rather, all those who were opposed to imperialism should have joined or should join a Soviet-led alliance to fight American imperialism. So therefore, this is one. The second important irritant, or one can say that during this period, was of course non-aligned movement, and it was a fallout of the Cold War politics. Non-aligned movement, of course, was a movement of the decolonized nations, and this movement was essentially meant to create not a third bloc, but it was essentially meant to basically retain autonomy and freedom in decision making, and to preserve and protect national sovereignty, which basically was acquired after such a long fight. So therefore, this non-aligned movement was another important factor in India-US relationship in this period. But interestingly, there are certain other factors which cannot be ignored here. And one of them was, of course, the conflicting models of economic development the two countries were practicing and they had adopted. As it is well known, United States of America believed in free enterprises, a market economy, and basically, export oriented, economic strategy, and so on and so forth. Whereas India, went for a different model of economic development, which was planned economic model, which was basically a state controlled economy. It was based on import substitution strategy, and so on and so forth. So therefore, the two models were different, and there are also conflicts basically on this on this issue, because United States of America wanted free trade and free commerce and open access to global market, but India and other countries of non-aligned movement were basically pursuing a policy which restricted market access to these powers. So therefore, there was a basically difference in terms of the entire strategy the two countries adopted for their economic growth and economic prosperity. Apart from this, there was also other factors during this Cold War period, which lasted till 89, or one can say 91, when formally Soviet Union disintegrated and this bipolar nature of world politics changed and became unipolar, because United States of America remained the only important superpower at that time. During this period, Cold War politics, there were 2-3 important issues which basically were looming large on India's political horizon, and here American approach was basically not only detested but was basically seen with suspicion in India. One was American approach in Kashmir, because integration of Kashmir had taken place, though in fact India, Pakistan, it became a bone of contention. This matter was taken to United Nations, a resolution was passed by the United Nations, but nonetheless the conditionalities for those resolutions were also not met, and one of them was that Pakistan had to vacate those territories which it had occupied. But nonetheless, what we find that this approach of United States of America on Kashmir kept vacillating, but in one respect it was very consistent, that was it never appreciated India's stand. And therefore, later on when we find that Pakistan became it's a client state and joined the military alliances of CENTO and SEATO, we find that United States openly supported Pakistan's stand on Kashmir. So therefore, this was another dimension which made them to drift in different directions so far as international politics is concerned. Now then, in 60s, after there was a Sino-Soviet rift, Soviet Union and China had differences, then we find that a different kind of alignment took place in world politics, and this is known as US-Sino Deta, the kind of friendship which United States of America established with China. And gradually we find that a new triangle emerged in South Asia, and that triangle was US-China-Pakistan triangle, and therefore it was basically a kind of encirclement of India, and that also drifted them apart. Then of course 1971 war, particularly the liberation of Bangladesh and the war, and American approach during the war was also disliked by India, and that made United States of America clearly, if not anti-India, but then definitely two countries were in two opposing camps. And gradually we find that because India had a peace and friendship treaty with Soviet Union, and therefore India was considered a close ally of Soviet Union, and in spite of being a non-aligned country, it was argued that India non-alignment was only a garb for supporting Soviet Union. But that was in fact 60s and 70s when radicalization of non-aligned movement was taking place under Mrs. Indira Gandhi and so on and so forth. But even earlier, non-alignment, as I mentioned, was not appreciated by United States of America. So this is the history of relationship during Cold War period. As you have seen that how Cold War non-alignment on issue of Kashmir and on issue of Pakistan and other issues, United States and India had a conflicting and different perspectives. But here I would also like to add one another important irritant, and that was basically the nuclear question. Because when nuclear non-proliferation treaty was signed, India refused to sign it on this basis that it was a discriminatory treaty. India argued for complete disarmament and elimination of nuclear weapons, not this selective disarmament which the superpowers practiced, and this was also not appreciated. So therefore, nuclear weapons was also one of the irritants. But one thing we should remember, so far the irritants in the relationship are concerned, they should be put as Cold War, Pakistan, the Kashmir question, the nuclear weapons, and the model of economic development. And finally, we find that when 1979 Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and in order to fight Soviet forces, United States of America started arming Pakistan and created a kind of army of fighters in name of Mujahideen, the religious fighters against Soviet army in Afghanistan. In fact, what happened that it had a lot of implications for security in the South Asia, particularly India, and therefore what we find that it completely transformed the geostrategic situation in South Asia. India was at the receiving end, and therefore, in fact, in spite of not having any direct conflict of interest with United States of America, India's entire relationship, India's entire approach in international politics was at divergence so far as United States of America is concerned. So this is something we should remember so far in India-US relationship is concerned. Interestingly, India and US, as I mentioned, they do not have any direct conflict of interest in terms of border or any other things. But in spite of not having direct conflict of interest, for such a long period of time in history, that was for 5 decades, India and United States were estranged partners or estranged members of the global community. Of course, one thing is, in fact, to be remembered that things have started changing in post-Cold War situation. Of course, the change was not immediate and change was not very fast, but rather gradually the changes starting taking place. And many things have contributed in those changes. We will take up those issues later when we will come to 90s and the subsequent period in this relationship. But one thing is important, that there were many positives and negatives of this Cold War politics. Because what we find that positives and negatives of Cold War politics are to be studied or discussed simply because normally it is believed that Cold War means that both were estranged members, estranged friends, estranged partners, and there was no communication, no working relationship, and so on and so forth. But that was not the case. In spite of such significant differences on number of issues, India and United States of America also had engagement in many spheres, in many areas. For example, India was the largest recipient of US aid, during that period. That is the period of Cold War. In fact, food aid to India, which was given under PL 480, which was suspended in 60s, and subsequently India was hard pressed to think in terms of alternative strategy like Green Revolution and so on and so forth, where India's Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri also gave the slogan of Jai Jawan and Jai Kishan for self-reliance in a matter of food and other things. But nonetheless, in this period we find that India was not only the largest recipient of US aid, but India's the American food assistance to India under PL 480 was also very important support to tide over the crisis during particularly emerging out of famine and drought and so on and so forth. In fact, from the World Bank, the kind of assistance which is given under IDA, international development assistance, that was accorded to India, that was basically made available to India, which was normally not done in every case. So therefore, that would not have also happened without some sort of green signal given by United States of America. In fact, the kind of importance United States of America attached to India can be seen from the fact that important civil servants and intellectuals were appointed as ambassadors of India. For example, Chester Boyles, Galbraith, and some of the names one can mention here that who were this ambassador, American ambassador in India. Now, of course, these are the positives. In fact, there are many other positives that the collaboration, or one can say the cooperation in the field of education, in the field of culture also continued. In fact, here one can mention the kind of role which certain foundations, American foundations like Rockefeller, Ford, etc. played in educational sphere for supporting a scholarship, for supporting scholars both American and Indian to do research and study on these two countries. So therefore, these cooperation, these engagements continued. But nonetheless, in fact, there are many negatives also from this period. And one of the negatives was, of course, this creation of Pakistan, China, United States triangle, which gradually materialized, particularly after Sino-American data of 60s and early 70s. And then, most importantly, the most important negative factor which one can see in this period was the societal distrust in these two countries. That what is called normally track to diplomacy, the cultural diplomacy, the societal peoples to peoples diplomacy, or peoples to peoples engagement. It is not that the peoples to peoples engagement with Soviet Union was also very strong, but United States of America, particularly being a Western country, where many Indians had been going from very early on, and therefore they had settled. They were NRIs, they were Indian diaspora, United States of America, the same diaspora which has started playing such an important role in recent years and recent decades, that it is one of the important variable in this India-US relationship today. The Indian diaspora, United States of America, the contribution they are making in scientific and technological development of United States of America, the kind of role they are playing in their democratic process. And therefore, what happened that in this period, of course, the size may not have been as big as it is today, but nonetheless, this diaspora was there, but still we find that a lot of societal mistrust between the two countries. If anything wrong happened in India, it was attributed to American interference. And the Americans also didn't take very kindly India's approach on any of the issues in which United States of America was involved, including the Vietnam War or any crisis in the Far East, or anything related to the Cold War. So therefore, what normally we find that in this period, the societal distrust was perhaps the most important negative fall of this Cold War politics. And then one should also not minimize the role Cold War politics played in bringing this entire thing on India's doorstep. That is in Pakistan and Afghanistan through alliance formation, and subsequently when Soviet invasion of Afghanistan took place by creating forces on Afghanistan-Pakistan border to fight Soviet Union in name of Mujahideens, but finally that led to the radicalization of South Asia, and its tentacles spread in different parts of the world. United States of America also became its victim after 9/11 in 2001, when it decided to start a war against terror. So therefore, what we find that there are many negatives of the Cold War era also. If we have seen the positives, that in spite of having differences on number of issues, both countries continued their engagement in certain areas in spite of having such deep level of mistrust. But nonetheless, the negatives one can say that overpower the positives, and therefore there were more negatives than the positives. Now what we find that this Cold War politics ended, and a new interest was generated, United States of America, so far as India is concerned. And this new interest in India was largely on account of a combination of factors, but then there are 2-3 important things here to remember. Of course, the earlier interest, as we have mentioned, that India was not a developed country. India's economic development was sluggish. It was basically hovering around 3.5% growth rate, which picked up later in 80s when Mrs. Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi tried to do some liberalization and basically touched 5.5 and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, Indian economy or Indian economic growth and this story was not taken very seriously in United States of America. But then what type of interest they had? Because today, of course, it is well known that American rate India as one of the fastest growing economies along with China, and therefore considers India's market to be very important, and therefore India as a very important player in global politics. But at that time that was not the case. Then what were the other reasons that United States of America considered India to be important factor in world politics? And it is here we should remember India's leadership of non-aligned movement and its role in G77, a pressure group which was created within non-aligned bloc to basically argue out the case or mobilize the opinion or to create a pressure politics within United Nations General Assembly. So therefore, the leader of non-aligned movement and a leader of G77, India's importance was always there for United States of America. But in recent years, in the post-Cold War period, that is not the case because non-aligned movement didn't remain as viable or a potent force in global politics as it was earlier. Then how India's importance increased. And here we can remember the importance which has been largely on account of a certain development, that is trade, monetary policies, access to Indian market, and most importantly, this new balance of power which has emerged in Asia vis-a-vis China, particularly in South Asia. So therefore, India's importance from the point of view of American foreign policy has been on account of both economic and geostrategic considerations. From point of view of economic, we have already seen that the post-liberalized economy in India gave a lot of importance to this Indian economy in American calculation of things, and from the geostrategic calculation, this new balance of power situation which is emerging in Asia and South Asia, particularly after emergence of China as a major force in world politics, have completely transformed the American interest and American calculation so far as its relationship with India is concerned. Okay. Hello. So we are discussing India-US relationship and particularly the transformation in this relationship which has happened over the years, particularly in post-Cold War period. But one thing we should remember, that this transformation in the relationship has not happened overnight or abruptly, but there has been a gradual process, and that process can be seen both in terms of certain changes which happen in India as well as certain changes which happen at the global plane. And what are those changes? It is important to remember those changes and take stock of those changes. Now, in fact, what are the post-war Cold War changes? The first important change, of course, was this transformation from a bipolar world to a multipolar world. And this bipolarity which characterized the Cold War period was ended in after the end of Cold War, and particularly during the Gulf War of 1990. When United States of America not only demonstrated its military superiority, but also established that the world was basically under the grip of unipolar situation, when only United States of America could decide what would happen to world politics. So therefore, this was most important change. And India from the very beginning has been opposed to both unipolar and bipolar politics. India from the very beginning was basically striving for a world which was democratic and multipolar. So of course, this conflicting perspective has persisted from the very beginning. It persists even today. We'll look at this dimension later. Then of course, domestically we can say that on domestic front there was a liberalization of economy in India, and this liberalization was largely on account of balance of payment crisis of 1991. And during that crisis, in order to tide over that crisis, India not only liberalized its economy, but also went for a structural adjustment program as suggested and advised by World Bank and International Monetary Fund, IMF. So therefore, this structural adjustment strategy, which World Bank and IMF were basically suggesting to many developing countries, particularly African countries who were under debt trap, and therefore, when India approached them for assistance to tide over this balance of payment crisis, the similar suggestion was made to India. But India had this time no option. But one thing we should remember, as I was mentioning, that liberalization had started a little early, particularly in the 80s during Mrs. Indira Gandhi's second coming, and also coming to power, and also subsequently Rajiv Gandhi's tenure. But of course, during this period, we also find that growth little bit picked up. But still, it was a half-hearted liberalization. It was not a structural adjustment. And therefore, during that period, we find that little bit of rapprochement happening between India and US in certain areas, particularly advanced technology and so on and so forth during Rajiv Gandhi's tenure, particularly on space technology, communication technology, and other things. Even during Mrs. Gandhi's tenure, we find that Reagan and Mrs. Gandhi had arrived at certain negotiated settlement on certain issues so far as such collaborations are concerned. But 91 onwards, we find a different story altogether. India, under a condition of stress, had to open up its economy, and one of the major irritant between India and US from the very beginning was this model of economic development and strategy which India had adopted. That was the closed economy, import substitution, state control, and a number of things. And therefore, with this liberalization, opening up of the market, one major irritant between the two countries, of course, got eliminated. And therefore, we find that this important dimension in the relationship has to be understood so far India-US relationship is concerned. But at the same time, in spite of this change, we don't find that United States of America softened its stand on number of pending issues, including Kashmir, human rights, or on WTO, or for example nuclear weapons. Rather, in fact, we go by the memoir of then Foreign Secretary J.N. Dixit in this crucial period when Narasimha Rao was India's Prime Minister and he was Foreign Secretary. In his memoir, he writes that whenever he went to United States of America to negotiate with them, the interlocutors invariably mentioned these three things: capping nuclear strategy or nuclear weapons, honoring human rights in Kashmir, and the third important dimension which was often mentioned was that India's claim for the United Nations Security Council would be based on these on these performance on these in these areas. So therefore, this is how United States of America looked at the problems or the issues confronting India. What I am trying to say that in spite of the changes in economy, United States of America didn't soften its stand. Rather, it became more hardened. In fact, the Gulf War, which completely transformed America's self-perception, that it was the only important power in the world, and therefore it could do things at its will. And therefore, after 1991 Gulf War, we find that United States and some of its allies started seriously contemplating to impose sanction on those countries who were not signatories to nuclear non-proliferation treaty, and therefore through sanctions they could be pressurized to fall in line so far as capping this nuclear capability is concerned. So therefore, India was hard pressed because India's nuclear research was on the threshold. Indian scientists, of course, through indigenous research and indigenous support, and because what characterized this global politics after nuclear non-proliferation treaty came into existence was the technology denial regime, and NPT was just the marker of that regime. But another important factor was the creation of NSG, Nuclear Supplier Group. And interestingly, the Nuclear Supplier Group was created in 1974 after Pokhran 1, when India had exploded its tested nuclear weapons. That was a peaceful nuclear test. But nonetheless, NSG was created to basically keep tap on or control the nuclear trade and commerce in the world, because non-signatories to this nuclear non-proliferation treaty could not get access to this technology. So therefore, this technology denial regime, which United States of America presided, that regime India was always at the receiving end. So therefore, we find that in spite of liberalization of economy, other irritants, or one can say that entire approach of United States of America didn't change much. But one thing, of course, we should also remember that in spite of these continuing irritants, we find that there are many common interests. We find between United States and India becoming more visible. And what are those commonalities? What are those common areas or the convergence of interest in this period, that is the post-Cold War period? Now, in fact, one thing we should remember, that United States of America is the second largest trading partner after China, so far India is concerned. In fact, United States of America today is the most important source of foreign investment. In fact, one can say that the presence and involvement of United States of America in India's neighborhood certainly impacts India's security environment, and therefore, in fact, one cannot say that United States of America is not important for India, or in fact was not important earlier. But of course, today's its importance has increased manifold because of number of transformations which I mentioned, both inside India and at the global level. Now, in fact, one can say that India's future role in world affairs would also depend on how it manages its relationship with the United States of America. Because one thing we should remember, that India's claim for membership of Security Council, permanent member of Security Council, in fact, when United States of America's President Barack Obama came to India, and he clearly endorsed India's candidature for this Security Council, one gets this impression that of late United States appreciates India's stand on this. Even the membership of NSG, Nuclear Supplier Group, particularly in aftermath of civil nuclear deal of 2005 and 2008, 123 agreement of Atomic Atomic Energy Act of United States of America of 1954, and there is a clause 123, and India, United States of America signed this 123 agreement in 2005, which is known as civil nuclear deal, that India has to separate its nuclear resources for both civilian and military purposes. And for civilian purposes, in spite of not signing nuclear non-proliferation treaty, there could be trade and commerce with United States of America and other countries of the world. And this was a major change, but we will basically come to this issue later when we will discuss imposition of sanction and lifting of sanction and transformation in post-2000 period. So therefore, this is important that in spite of these irritants, there are commonalities. Second largest trading partner, most important source of foreign investment. Its involvement in India's neighborhood always impacts India's security environment, and then they have a common interest today in fighting terrorism, environmental degradation, climate change, drug trafficking, HIV, AIDS, and other such menaces. One thing we should remember, that when we talk of fighting terrorism, of course there is a difference in perception. When United States of America talks of terrorism, it has basically a different type of outfit or different type of terrorist group in mind. But when India talks of terrorism, fighting terrorism, it always talks about cross-border terrorism, because India has been at its receiving end. But one thing we should remember, that earlier United States of America didn't recognize the gravity of the situation, which it has started recognizing today, particularly after 9/11, when this entire terrorism reached its doorstep. And therefore, this war against terror, particularly its role in Afghanistan, particularly fight against Taliban and other things, one can say that has created a new convergence of interest between India and United States of America. This convergence we didn't find earlier, in spite of two democracies, the largest and the oldest, in spite of common political values, in spite of many commonalities and working relationship. But still, this convergence which we find today was not there earlier. Apart from this, we should also mention that both countries, India and United States of America, depend on oil from the West Asia, and therefore they are interested in maintaining peace, stability and tranquility in West Asian region. And this is also one important issue. Similarly, in Indian Ocean, in fact, earlier India was, as a leader of non-aligned movement, continuously pleaded for declaring Indian Ocean as zone of peace. But that was not appreciated by the superpowers. But today, when we find India and United States of America speaking not in the same language, but basically they are on the same wavelength when they talk of basically maritime security, when they talk of peace and stability in Indian Ocean region, when we find that a number of strategic dialogue between India and Pakistan, India and United States of America, not only on issues related to terrorism, but on number of issues, science, technology, energy, security, and one important thing, this maritime security. So therefore, we find that the convergence is now going beyond only the economic dimension of this relationship, which is related to Indian market as one of the fastest growing economy in the world. So the convergence now stretches to different areas, and those areas are both strategic, political, geostrategic as well as economic. But the most importantly, what we find today, that is the China factor in India-US relationship. This factor was not there during Cold War period. Rather, it was present but in a different way. It was present in terms of encirclement of India through this US, China, Pakistan triangle. But today this China factor has come in a different way. The rise of China, particularly its economic growth, the prowess which it has acquired, and therefore it has started now challenging United States of America's basically hegemony in world politics. And United States of America knows very well that the other rising economy or rising power is India, and both are neighbors and both have had a checkered relationship. Both have had a relationship of discord, and therefore United States of America sees in India a potential check on China's rising power. So therefore this new balance of power situation which is emerging in Asia, and particularly in South Asia and in Southeast Asia, we find that United States of America considers India to be a very important player in fact in this entire global situation. Now what have happened, that how this post-war posturings from the both sides have taken place. This is also important, because these posturings are important in international politics. Now we can start with the Gulf War, that what happened between India and US. During Gulf War, India not only supported all United Nations resolutions sponsored by United States of America on the Gulf War, but also allowed refueling of its fighter jets and allowed them to fly over its territory. Now, in fact, we find that later that India also voted in favor of repealing United Nations resolution on Zionism, equating with racism. In fact, we find that the strategic dialogue started between India, regular strategic dialogue on number of issues, from security to fighting terrorism to scientific and technological collaboration. Both countries undertook joint naval exercises. In fact, security in Malacca Strait was provided by India to its naval ships. So we find that on number of occasions, the posturing from Indian side was also positive. On the other hand, from the American side, we find that the posturings in 90s were not as positive as perhaps in the 21st century, at least in the first decade of 21st century. And there were reasons for that, because the 90s, United States of America, looked at its own power as basically, invincible. And therefore, in self-perception, it considered it to be the only superpower. And India ranked nothing before United States of America. And India was, of course, in throes of crisis after this balance of payment crisis. And later on, when India decided to go for its nuclear test in Pokhran 2, 1998, United States of America imposed sanction on India. Of course, India in 98 was in a position, because the reforms were already 7 years old, and therefore it was in a position to withstand this pressure, and it successfully managed its economy in spite of sanctions. But two things happened. In fact, in this period, one important thing is this dialogue which started between India and United States of America. And this dialogue was to some extent historic between India and US. 8 rounds of dialogue between two interlocutors. One, Jaswant Singh, who was the foreign minister of India under NDA-1 Vajpayee's government, and Talbot, who was Deputy Secretary of State under Clinton administration. And Talbot-Jaswant dialogue is now historic so far as India-US relationship is concerned. Number of conditionalities were imposed. Number of factors came into discussion. But finally, we find that this dialogue culminated into Clinton's visit to India in 2000. And it was during this visit that the sanction which United States of America had imposed in 1998, Clinton, as the President of United States of America, declared that it was lifting. And this lifting of sanction basically heralds a new era in India-US relationship. In fact, he went to the extent of mentioning in one of the speeches in Bombay, when he was addressing Chamber of Commerce, that no future world politics could be seen without engaging India, or a very active involvement with India. So this is how he looked at this Indian engagement in 2000. But he was heading a democratic government. He was succeeded by a Republican government by Bush, and that was perhaps more significant in terms of this engagement, because it was during Bush's tenure that we find that this civil nuclear deal in 2005 was inked between Manmohan Singh and George Bush, American president. So this was the beginning of a new chapter between India-US relationship. So in fact, what we find that this posturings from the both side, and then the sanction and the lifting of sanction is very important. But then why this sanction was lifted? 1998, India basically tested nuclear weapons. Sanctions were imposed, but 2000 it was lifted. Though India didn't sign CTBT 96, refused to sign CTBT. It is a different matter that CTBT was also not endorsed by its Congress. But nonetheless, India had refused. India didn't sign NPT and even then tested nuclear weapons, and therefore attracted this sanction. There are a number of explanations given by scholars that why sanctions were lifted. One explanation is that this Indian diaspora United States of America as a major force in public opinion making, pressurized the American democratic discourse and democratic leaders or Democrats who were heading the government at that time, that India should not be seen as part of the problem, rather India should be seen as a part of the solution. Now, India may not be a de jure nuclear power, but nonetheless it has become a de facto nuclear power. Therefore, if this non-proliferation policy is to be pursued, then it is always advisable to take India on board and therefore use India to basically push this non-proliferation regime in the world. So, this was one. The number two was this China dimension, the China factor. The American public opinion also believed at that time that India is a countervailing force against China, and therefore United States of America, instead of strangulating India's voice and therefore coming hard on India after nuclear test, should try to take India on board and try to create a different balance of power in Asia. And third thing was this attraction for Indian market, because India's growth story by that time had become quite prominent. India was showing its credential as a very important economic player in the global scene. So therefore, all these things played important role in this new equation which was emerging between India and United States of America. But one thing is to be remembered, that this U.S. confrontational attitude continued even in this period on some issues. One was NPT, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. In spite of lifting of sanctions, Clinton coming and endorsing India's role in world politics, but nonetheless on Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty they continued to argue that India should sign it, and CTBT of course was there earlier. Then another important issue on which two countries were not seeing eye to eye even in this period, post Cold War period, when this posturing from the both sides for a positive vibes, one can say, were there for on improving the relationship. Another factor was World Trade Organization, access to market, and number of issues on which India and United States of America had differing perspectives. And we can see that it has continued even till recent years. The Doha round of WTO, when trade facilitation treaty, related to agriculture, how there was difference in perception. Of course, United States of America later on, deferred it under India's request, but nonetheless, these differing perspectives. Earlier, we have seen that how India was always threatened by United States trade representative, for imposing Super 301, the act under which certain restrictions and the sanctions are posed or imposed on a defaulter country. So therefore, WTO and Super 301 type of measures, always United States of America flaunts against India. Then human rights dimension, because human rights earlier particularly, whether it was a matter of social clause attached to WTO rules and regulations, particularly related to child labor, environmental concerns and other things, and also human rights in Kashmir. So this is another dimension which remains a bone of contention between India and United States of America. Kashmir, of course, the approach has changed, and that can be seen from Clinton's statement in 2000 itself, when it said that of course United Nations had a resolution on Kashmir, but many things have changed over the years. So indirectly what he hinted, that instead of sticking to that resolution, we should look beyond it, that how this matter can be approached. And then most importantly, during Kargil war, when India, of course, this new relationship had not started, even then United States of America brought pressure on Pakistan to basically retreat. So therefore, we find that this entire approach has changed, and the 9/11 of 2001 has completely transformed American perspective on number of issues, including Kashmir, because now it looks at it through the prism of war against terrorism and radicalization of South Asia. So therefore, number of confrontational issues have changed, but still there are many divergent, the persistence of the divergence continues. What are those persistence? On what areas it is persisting, that is important. One is the United States is a status quoist power in the world today, whereas India aspires for change in everything, from United Nations to international forums like WTO, IMF, World Bank, and so on and so forth. Number two, India from the very beginning has been championing this multipolar aspiration, multipolar world, and has a multipolar aspiration, whereas United States of America is a hegemonic power and wants to continue a unipolar world. Similarly, India champions the cause of developing nations within WTO and other fora, multilateral fora, whereas United States of America has a different perspective. United States of America wants third generation economic reforms in India, which includes labor reforms, environmental reforms, and other things, whereas India is basically dragging its feet, because those reforms mean tampering with many legislations which are earned with a lot of fight by Indian labor and other things. And then there is asymmetry of power between the two countries, and most importantly the nuclear non-proliferation and the nuclear concerns remain there. So therefore there are regions of divergence of views, but nonetheless we can say they are engaged power. There are mutuality of interest on number of issues, UN reform, on terrorism, on climate change, and most importantly China factor. We find that India and United States of America are not only working closely, but appreciate each other's position on the global fora and in global politics.
Dear friends, on that note, we would like to thank Dr. Jha for coming to our show and delivering this lecture. And thank you, dear friends, watching our show. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.